Thank you so much for being with us here at the Voice of America. It's nice to have you in Washington.
Thank you.
This is the final year of this administration. Just briefly, how would you define the period, the Obama administration's relationship with Central Asian governments?
Expectations were somehow very high in the sense that we really needed a change in tones, in short-term policies, but also in long-term objectives, if you want. Whereas 8 years down the track, we really realized that not much has changed. The objectives were framed in relation not to the region proper, but to somewhere else. In terms of Afghanistan, we realized that there wasn't a real change in how to identify viable partners in the region, in the sense that the regimes were still kept at what is the core of the bilateralism in US Central Asia. And also that having a regular engagement does not mean having a good engagement. And this is what the C5+1 actually indicated. Having a more regular structure of engagement with the Central Asian government does not really mean that you will have a qualitative improvement in both the relationship and what the relationships actually mean for the local populations. So 8 years down the track, there hasn't been an engagement with non-regime actors. The elites are still talking directly with Washington. And what we've seen is that if you just think in terms of realpolitik or realist situation, we see that the influence of the US in Central Asia has decreased even further.
The Obama administration is very proud of the fact that they started annual bilateral consultations with the governments of Central Asia, regular dialogue, as you just mentioned, and of course C5, 5 Central Asian governments, and then the US working together to bring the region to integration, to economic, connectivity. They want this to be the legacy of this administration.
We've seen the exactly same policy applied in the EU. 2007, they had the strategy for a new partnership with Central Asia, which had a very regular calendar of meeting to be followed each year, very structured, human rights dialogues, foreign ministry, troikas, stuff like that. But 8 years on the track, we've seen that it doesn't matter how often you are, what matters is the issues that are on the table. So in terms of liberalization, in terms of promotion of human rights, we haven't heard a lot of change, or neither in the US case or in the European, incidentally. So having a regular meeting, Navbahor, doesn't really indicate that you're going to talking about the right issues, if this is what you want to say. So have you declared, as you always have, in terms of US government, that there is a quantitative improvement in local authoritarianism as part of what you promote in the region? We haven't seen much of that being done. Some good things have occurred. There are some exchange programs, building contacts with some, if you want, students and things like that. But in general terms, having a more regular calendar hasn't brought, and probably will not bring, a substantive improvement in what they actually will do in the region.
Well, despite all the difficulties and challenges in Central Asia, the way the Western governments seem to regard Central Asia is like this. It's not melting down. There is no crisis in Central Asia. No country, no situation really requires immediate intervention. And we disagree on many points with the Central Asian governments, but we can still work and cooperate on mutual interests. Do you observe that kind of dynamics too?
I observe the fact that not only governance in the region has, if you want, deteriorated, but also situations like health policies, education policies, and in general terms, respect of political rights or civil rights or media freedom as going down.
Yeah, but as far as then the US or European Union is concerned, they see, well, those are the issues that the region, the governments, the countries, the societies need to work on themselves.
Yeah, but obviously the condition of authoritarian stability in Central Asia serves the purposes of the US and the EU, if you want, and of course allows them to deal with local elites for more strategic issues, which are security and oil and gas, if you think about the EU. But is this the right way of doing things? Is this what you can only, if you only engage with the elite, you can't forget of all the people that are there. So the stability of that Central Asia has got, which is a stable region,
Relatively.
yeah, well, I mean, is a stability of authoritarianism, stability of having a very stable governments because the people don't change at the top. It's the stability of having a constant elite that is getting more and more, is getting richer because the cronyism is actually increasing on a daily basis. And we've seen this in Kazakhstan, we see this, of course, in Kyrgyzstan across the, just before the two change of leadership. We've seen this, to the maximum extent in Turkmenistan. But we also see a region in which the youth is very disenfranchised. In most cases, the gap between urban and rural areas is increasing in socioeconomic terms, in health issues. So we've seen a deterioration of human security, if you want, whereas elite stability stays because we haven't been much change.
So are you saying that the European and American diplomats, policymakers cannot get away by saying, well, the changes, the positive changes should come from within those societies, that don't expect us to make those kind of miraculous changes in the region?
Change should come from within, and that's true. And of course, here, don't forget that the first responsibility is on the local leaderships. They are the most, if you want, the biggest culprits, if you want, in all of this. But engaging with local elite without being, by transforming human rights issues into cosmetic issues on bilateral agendas, regular or less frequent, it's not something which has brought any substantive change or has facilitated engagement with, with local actors. And we've seen this, the best example of this is the Kazakhstani OSCE chairmanship. The Madrid commitments were signed in 2007, which is 9 years now, and what we've seen two snap elections across 14 months in which there was no real competition, there was no real campaign, in which everything was just a charade. That's just a few years after the chairmanship. So engagement without a price tag, without conditionality, or also diluting conditionality in any circumstances, has not brought any improvement. So as the actors that you mentioned, so the EU and the US, have also always mentioned the improvement of governance in the region as their objective. It's not me, it's them. You've realized that this hasn't changed. So either the methods of engagement or the issues on the agenda that have not worked. So across the 8 years of the Obama administration, you could agree with me that the quality of governance in Central Asia has deteriorated further, despite of being very engaged with the US or the EU.
Well, speaking of governance, the regimes have been successful in convincing the majority, not everyone, but the majority, that this is the best we can do at this point. Yeah, there are a lot of difficulties, but things could be worse. This is the best we can do as a nation at this point. Looking at Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, two big countries of the region, how strong do you think the regimes are now? Because, as you know, many experts predict that there will be some kind of crisis when the current leaders are no more.
I think that your examples are spot on. We have two different dimensions. The first one is that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are both led by the first president. So there hasn't been a change. So Karimov and Nazarbayev have been in power for 25 years now. And people look at that with saying, this is the guy that took us out of independence. So it comes with an extra clout, if you want. It comes with some respectability.
So that record helps them.
It does. And that's something which we see in Turkmenistan. Whereas Berdimuhamedov is probably as authoritarian as his predecessor, is looked less favorably by the people just because he's not the first president. So being the first president, however bad you are or however good you are, doesn't matter because you still are the first president. The exception here, Kyrgyzstan, but that's a different case. So
Where they actually have a former president.
yes.
Amazingly.
Yeah, so Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan being led by first generation leaders, that actually was something that helped them to stay on. But the second one is that Central Asia has perfected a number of methods of soft authoritarianism, which are more in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which are surprisingly effective. Media, using the media as vehicles for portraying a message of success in Kazakhstan, selling the Nazarbayev dream in that sense, or creating the sort of situation in which state success, particular state success, is emphasized. You know, don't forget, I mentioned before the OSCE chairmanship. When that happened, the symbol of the logo of the OSCE was on the milk box in Kazakhstan, because every house should know that the regime has accomplished something. The WTO membership as well. So we've seen here that they have mastered this policy of persuasion to the extent to which they got very successful, and people do respect the leaders because of what I mentioned before, their clout, because of this soft authoritarian persuasion powers that and strategy they deliver. And then we've seen also more and more for those who, if they don't really believe in that, so they criticize or just they expect dissent, there is some repression on the side as well.
The governments in the region, as you know, justify their policies on religion by saying that these are necessary measures to prevent extremism, and most importantly, to maintain the secular systems. How secular are these societies now?
I think that in general terms, this is another example in which the Central Asians have learned the lesson of what the West has said in a very significant way, in a very evident way. The rhetoric on the Islamic threat became very, very strong in 2001, 2002, after 9/11. And that allowed them to do some regular rounds of repression. How secular they are relatively secular, I would say.
Authoritarian / secular.
The elite are. Islam is about good things. Islam is about decency, is about respect for the other, is about love, if you want. And we don't see that in the way in which the president conducts himself all the time. But they have recognized the fact that being seen occasionally as good Muslims, like going to Saudi Arabia, and we've seen this 2 weeks ago with Tajikistan, has actually bring them some legitimacy to the extent to which they are seen by people as being good Muslims. But they keep their secularity, and they keep the idea of having separating, if you want, the affair of the state with the affairs of religion, is actually what, even though themselves then, in order to justify the logical repression, they have brought Islam into the state by creating this Muslim directorate. So it's, if you want, it's a perverse mechanism in which state and religion should be separated, in which this is a secular state, but then the state, in order to justify logical repression, brings into his own inner workings, brings a mufti and the imams. In Tajikistan, they even got to the point in which they did have uniform for the clergy, if you want to call it like that, in that sense. So, but again, that's not for any reason of which goes beyond their own preservation of their own power. So you know that the inclusion of Islam into the workings of the state is in order to increase dynamics of control over the population. So we have a very small portion of Islam that is not controlled.
When the governments are criticized for restricting religious freedom, they say Islam is a part of our national culture. We don't want religion to become political.
I think that the best example to understand this is the Hajj, the pilgrimage, because in that context, the state did regulate very closely the access to one of the most personal dimension of Islamic life. Each Muslim, if he or she can afford, has to go once in their life to Mecca in the month in which the pilgrimage happens. But in Central Asia, the state has set obstacles to people to be able to go and get to Mecca. So we've seen that in terms of either transforming the process of selection into a corrupt issue, or to make it available only to few people by increasing the price of how much it is every year. Obviously, travel tickets and permission to go into the Hajj are regulated by state agencies that are allowed by the state and authorized by the state to select the people that go onto the Hajj. And it's $3,000-$4,000. A Kazakh pilgrim these days had to pay in between $3,200 and $3,900 to get to Mecca. This is significant money. And obviously what the government is trying to avoid is the inclusion of the Central Asian Islamic communities into a wider ummah, and which is replicating what the Soviets used to do.
That becomes a very sensitive business then. Then you have to open the way for the Muslims of Central Asia to freely interact with the rest of the Muslim world.
This is what you should do. You shouldn't really have, the only limit to the Hajj should be the quota that imposed by the Saudi ministry for the Hajj, for the pilgrimage. But Turkmenistan, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, only and ever allowed 55 pilgrims every year to go to Mecca. That was the number of pilgrims that could fit in the only plane that the government of Turkmenistan did send over to Mecca in those days. And that's obviously setting hurdles. It's obviously avoiding that this Muslim in Central Asia connect with the Muslims in the Gulf especially. And we've seen this also with the education. There aren't, if you want, up-to-date research on this, because it's a very sensitive area. Data hard to come by, and when they are, they have to take with a grain of salt. But we could see that the general trend is that the Central Asian republics are not happy to have their young people to go and study in Mecca, Islamabad, and to lesser extent to Cairo, because obviously traveling within a Muslim, Islamic context, exposure to ideas that could be seen as dangerous, although they are not, or could they bring to some patterns of transforming your Islam into a public manifestation, into a public, if you want, culture that does really exceeds the social praxis limits that the governments are happy to stay within.
The governments are very wary of the foreign influence, on the Muslim practice, on the Islamic practice in the region. To what extent have they been successful, do you think, in terms of preventing bad ideas, extremist ideology, radical ideology coming from the countries of the Middle East, from Afghanistan, Pakistan?
Well, you could say they've been very successful. And this is what actually stays at the very core of the policy of control. On the one hand, insulating local Islam from foreign influence and subjugating every kind of Islamic manifestation to what the boundaries of the state, the directorates actually do, has been successful. But also equating the foreign with dangerous is something that has been done very successfully in Central Asia. And we've seen this especially in Kazakhstan, in which from 2011 onwards, we heard a lot of government rhetoric about Salafi and about warning the people of how complex these problems are, how dangerous they are, that a Salafi state is usually a state that punishes its citizens very much. I heard a lot of radio in Kazakhstan speaking about the idiosyncratic Islam that is in Saudi Arabia, of course presented to the people, so with propagandistic aims in mind. But it stays within the boundaries. What we see is it replicates the patterns of control that we see in other areas in Central Asia, in the media, in the political parties. The state is there, it's at the center of everything that happens. It exceeds its boundaries, it becomes more than what it is, and it occupies every inch of political space that you've seen. And that creates problem for alternative, not necessarily antagonistic expression of political ideas, religious, also social ideas. So the state has become even stronger into the last 25 years.
And yet you have hundreds of youth joining the terrorist groups. They're joining the extremists, despite all these measures that you have taken if you were a Central Asian government.
I am not one that believes that, first of all, the numbers are very big. I also don't believe that all they go are radicals. I think that there is a significant socio-economic component there, that getting a job within some workings of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, it does really bring you some money. So you got the chef, the drivers going there. They're all not just radical going and fighting.
Basically, the Islamic State and other groups, they're not just recruiting fighters.
Absolutely. Where do these people are recruited? Are they recruited in Central Asia, or they are Central Asian, they're living somewhere, or for instance Russia, and then they go to Syria or to Turkey? But of course, the first thing is that the first recruiter is the state, is the regime in Central Asia, having repressive policies, and also not delivering a decent level of socio-economic wealth, especially this in Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. We've seen that, where some, if you want, primary function of the states are collapsing. So not giving these people the prospect of a better life is actually something that recruits a lot of people. So to some extent, they get in the Islam they deserve, although that's marginal, very marginal, rather than a more general conversation.
You mean the governments?
The governments, yes. They are the first recruiter in that sense. Had they come up with better responses to localized crisis, unemployment, disenfranchisement, that would actually be the best solution against radicalization, which remains to me a marginal issue and one that has a lot to do with socio-economic problem, rather than just with the fact that this is a radical phenomenon that goes throughout, the currents of today's Islam.
The irony here is that in the eyes of the US government, Uzbekistan, when it comes to religious freedom, Uzbekistan has been a country of particular concern. It's been designated so, which means that sanctions could be used against Uzbekistan. Of course, this administration has chosen not to do that. We have seen several Uzbek citizens being arrested, several of them prosecuted and sentenced for long term in prison on terrorism charges in this country. So some experts say that it's becoming increasingly difficult for Washington to promote religious freedom in Uzbekistan when you have so-called Uzbek extremists here now in the United States. Do you think that complicates the picture?
The relation between Islam and the state, between the state and citizens who are abroad, is something very difficult to unravel. I think inserting a third actor into that, an actor which got an agenda, you mentioned the US in this case, complicates things even further.
But US has always been for religious freedom.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be contained to the Islamic side. We know the evangelical repressions in Turkmenistan and the marginalization of other faiths across the region is a regular strategy of power preservation, and we've seen this also in cases with the ethnic minorities, Turkmen, Uzbek Turkmen, Kazakhstan, and we've seen this everywhere. It's not just contained to religion. Obviously, is what I was saying before, is the state and the regime, in this sense, that try to expand its power to virtually every area, and there is no political space left across the religious arena, the political arena, the social arena, the ideas arena. That's the most important one. In Central Asia today, there is no space for ideas alternative to what the government wanted to think. And in that sense, this percolates down to all of these specific areas, so religious, economics, politics, and so on, because there has been a specific technology of power preservation that Nazarbayev, Karimov, Berdimuhamedov, and so on have constantly promoted in the 25 years. So it's not just religion, it's everything.
So keeping that very complex picture in mind, can Central Asia integrate the way for example, American visions?
I'm very skeptic about integration. My research at the moment, the one that I'm doing on Kazakhstan foreign policy, showed me that the Central Asian states do not trade with each other, not formally or informally. Commercial linkages are the first linkage to establish any kind of integration. That's why.
How can we start them doing that? How can we have them trade?
They won't, not the current elite, unless at least something spectacular happens. So that's why for the last 11 years, if I'm not wrong, we haven't had a Central Asia only organization that discusses how they relationship should be dealt with. Integration into more Eurasian institutions like Evrazes before and now the EU have just diluted any meaningful idea and practice of regional integration. The region is very much disintegrated as it ever was. So
basically every regime is trying very hard to keep itself alive.
There are a lot of collective challenges. And collective challenges do require collective solutions, collective responses. Climate change, water issues, energy issues, not having an electricity grid unified in the region, that's something that has to be discussed amongst the five. You can't just having a bilateral things for that.
So at some point you just have to come together.
At some point, there will be a time when push will come to shove. And then that will happen. We will see what kind of resilience and ability to respond they have. But I just wanted to go back to what you were saying before about the new Silk Roads. And it's interesting that a lot of money is put into infrastructure at the times at which there is a general economic crisis across the region.
And the money is coming mainly from China.
Yeah, so the thing is that why do you need more trains, more freeways, more highways, if there is no internal demand? You could argue that Central Asia, of course,
if you're not manufacturing much,
yeah,
for
exactly.
example.
If a conduit for somewhere else to bring the goods for China to the West, the Western China, Western Europe road, why do we need more trains? The numbers are down. This morning I was reading that Xinjiang Central Asia trade is down 30% across 1 year. If you look at passengers numbers in Kazakhstan, they went down 15% in the train line KZT last year. Why do we need to build more trains? Why do we need to build more? There is a lot of corruption going on. This Eurasian infrastructure is bringing money into the pocket. I mean, this is my, I haven't got anything to, if you want to, but it doesn't add up. Having a massive infrastructure development at a time in which there is no internal demand, and once you're taking away re-export and shuttle trade across the region, and once you consider that there are longer, more far-flung trade to be done between Western Europe and Western China, you then realize that this frenzy for infrastructure across Eurasia got to do something to do with dynamics of cronyism, of patrimonialism, that again are meant to allow the current regimes to stay on for a while more.
I'm yet to talk to an expert on Central Asia who does not think that China is not it in the region. China is it. China is the future. China is doing this. China is doing that. Everything is compared to what China is doing in the region. Of course, U.S. officials will try to convince you and me that America is not and will never compete with China or Russia in the region, that it's fine if they're doing more work in the region, on the region, it's fine. We have some, mutual interests. But is China actually doing a lot? Aren't we overestimating the role of China at this particular time? Isn't this some kind of hype sometimes? Because how do we measure the Chinese influence? Or where do we see a meaningful economic development that is being translated from the Chinese investment in the region? Or is it too early to see?
No, China is good because it does some things that the regimes haven't got either the power or the inclination to do. So in that sense, they've been building roads, they've been building infrastructure, they've been building, the public
Are
goods.
they creating jobs? Because as far as the ordinary folks are concerned, when they hear, oh, China is really getting big in our region, they're obviously looking around, fine, bazaars are filled with Chinese products. Every bazaar, every market in the world is filled with Chinese products. What are the signs that we should be looking for?
Look, I'm not sure that employment is a solution of that, but connectivity, roads, yes. You go to the region and you see that street, that road being very nice and the one next door being full of holes, potholes, stuff like that. And you ask the people who made that and they say China did. That's a kind of public good provision that actually helps and helps the states who are not capable or to have, if you want, decided not to do it in the short term. It's a public good provision. They're doing things which the states are not doing. So that's something very interesting. That's something which obviously doesn't come with an influence agenda. I don't think in that sort of, if China goes up, Russia has to go down influence discourse. I think that it feeds a lot of the domestic objectives of economic development, things like that. But when it's such a big state with so many borders, your domestic needs become international issues. It's inevitable. So it could have to do with Xinjiang, it could have to do with energy, like the pipelines. And that's another big issue, like the pipeline, the 2009 pipeline for Turkmenistan to China. No one has done that. The Turkmenistan in between 92 and 2009 only built 2 short pipelines with Iran. They haven't been able to do anything. The Chinese came in and they built the pipeline in a few years. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Creating infrastructure which helps the regime and also helps the people to think that things are better in the short term. And
which also helps China.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
China is not missionaries, they do it, but it doesn't help China with the way in which they will dictate what happens in Ashgabat, in Tashkent. There's not that kind of power. I think that but it's all instrumental. The big winners are Chinese economic interests and again the regime which allow them to do that. But it could become a backfire. See Turkmenistan with the Galkinish development. CMPC is the only foreign company operating in Turkmenistan. They got some contract to do some work into exploration fields at Galkinish. Do you think that has been beneficial? No, in the long run it would be a problem. Because now with the pipeline that they use, all the gas is going into China for free because they're repaying the debt that they contracted by building the pipeline and by allowing and by also giving them into the fields. So they're selling more gas for virtually none. And when this debt will be extinguished, they will have to sell more gas at a much lower price. So putting all your egg in one basket, especially a basket it's held by China, can be problematic, and it won't pay off in the very long run. Now, we've got to say what the long run is. The long run is for the population. In that sense, it's not good. But for the regime, the long run is until they stay in power, which could be short, could be long, we don't know in terms of many years. Obviously, the perspective are to stay on as much as they can. And that's that I think that what you were saying, Navbahor, about the role of China is actually very important. That public good provision and support of economic interests actually reinforces both the regime directly and the local population to believe that things are, for a moment, for a short time, better and improving.
You have done a lot of research in Kazakhstan. What is the image of China in Kazakhstan?
I never directly worked on that, but...
Because I know that you're writing a book about Kazakhstan and Eurasianism. If Kazakhstan wants to be considered a Eurasian country, it can't, at the same time, it cannot avoid the impact of China, which is the largest Asian country next door.
The Eurasian policies of Kazakhstan only matter insofar as it's the regime that defines them. So to some extent, Kazakhstani Eurasianism or Neo-Eurasianism can actually mean everything and its opposite at the same time. It could be a little bit like Turkmen neutrality. in that sense. That is Nazarbayev that defines what Eurasianism means and what is Eurasia. Now, the policy of infrastructure is fascinating. There's a chapter in my book in which you see how this idea of the bridge between East and West, which is something, has actually been transformed at different times into rhetoric that justified economic immobility, not doing much because someone was doing it for you, which goes back to what you were saying before. The way in which China and the freeway, the Western China, Western Europe, is the perfect example of that. China built it with Chinese workers that never mingle with the population in Central Asia. But the road is there. So while the process of constructing the road was actually, have seen some problems between the locals and the Chinese, when that would be completed, people would say, well, China made that. So it's actually, when Nazarbayev defined what the bridge between East and West means, it's other powers who got to build that bridge. And that really redefines your perception as a state in a local environment, in a regional environment, in an international environment, to the extent to which you can claim success even if you rarely done anything. And that what you were saying probably in the very first question today, the fact that with your soft authoritarian methods and the strategy of persuasion, you get to people to believe that would happen. So Eurasianism in that sense works both internationally and domestically, because it's a message that is spread to the people in Kazakhstan to show that the regime is doing something. Whether it's them who are doing something or not doesn't really matter, because the success temporarily would be seen there.
American officials say that we have a lot of common interests with China and Russia in Central Asia, and they believe that they can work on them together with China and Russia.
I'm not one of those who believe that Central Asia has to be dominated by one power. I mean, the way in which the politics of the region has gone for 25 years now really shows to you
that they need everyone.
They need everyone, but not because they need one, because they themselves are so good at using different partners at different times to make sure that they power.
They want to have options.
They always have, and they have been extremely clever. One thing which we're led to admit about the first generation of leaders in Central Asia, they have been very clever about not even playing out.
All 5 of them?
Yeah, I mean...
Including Kyrgyzstan.
Well, Kyrgyzstan the experience there has been different, but if you look at power lengths, I mean, we've never seen in the other 4 a meaningful change. So these are states, these are elites who got out of resilience. So yes, I mean, they have used international support for their short-term, medium-term, long-term objectives. I mean, neutrality, it's all about the relationship with Russia. Neutrality forced Turkmenistan to entangle, disentangle different times, but ultimately what this policy is about keeping Niyazov and now Berdimuhamedov in power. So in that sense, it worked. And it worked because they could make it with the partnership that they have.
Interestingly, President Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan recently praised that policy. He said that.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, it's a kind of foreign policy that attracted international recognition with the UN approving them in 1995. It's a kind of foreign policy that it doesn't create any kind of constriction to you, because you can do whatever you want with that. It's the kind of foreign policy that allows you to be isolated and insulate at times and then be more involved with others. So it's a perfectly functioning foreign policy if your objective is to preserve your power. If your objective is to meaningfully, fully, and if you want correctly integrate with the rest of the world, you can't do like that. There are some problems. But obviously, being a domestically oriented foreign policy, that policy worked. So I'm not surprised that Karimov actually praised it.
Well, we'll continue watching. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.